Let's go to file item number 9, the lead scientist report. Dr. Goodwin.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to cover 3 items very quickly, and then obviously the main topic on our agenda right now is the science plan. But just to give you a brief update of other things which are happening in the science program, we also last week were involved in a series of interviews for the state fellows, and we're hoping to recruit 2 fellows for the coming year. One of those fellows would be assigned to the Independent Science Board activities. The other will be to our activities ourselves. And Sam and Marina, who are in the audience, I think they conducted the interviews, and I think we were blown away by 2 things. First of all, there's many agencies were part of this interview process. And what was very clear is that many of the agencies there are seeing this as a way of recruiting the next generation, because several of state agencies, the age structure is such that they're going to lose a lot of their talent in the next 5 years due to retirements. So that was quite striking, the agencies that mentioned that. On the other side, the quality of the state fellows that gave presentations and were interviewed were just outstanding. I mean, if this is the next generation that's going to be controlling our environment, and these are young people who they're scientists, but they want experience at the science policy interface, and they want their careers to be right at that interface. So I think it was very rewarding to have gone through that process. So that was last week. Since we last got together 3 weeks ago, there's 2 other big items that we've done. We convened an expert review panel on the long-term operations opinions. The intent of this panel was to inform the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the effectiveness of last year water operations and regulatory actions that are laid out in their RPAs, their reasonable and prudent alternative actions. And the review was a little different than it's been the last 2 years in that we focused on two projects. So instead of looking right across all of the operations, one was to look at the adaptive management of Clear Creek, which is absolutely critical in terms of the resilience and continued salmon in the Sacramento. And the second part was to look at the spring 2012 Delta operations. So that report should be receiving towards the end of the month, and then we'll report back when we see what those findings are. The other big activity that's been going on is that on Tuesday and Wednesday this week, it was the 3rd workshop in a series of 3 of the State Water Resources Control Board in their comprehensive review and update to the Bay Delta Plan. And if you recall, the science program was asked to convene an invited panel to kick off each of these workshops. And we were very pleased to support that because you as the council had sort of laid out the time frame for this comprehensive update. So we saw this was a way of assisting the board in achieving those targets. So Chris Enright convened the invited panel, and it was really a very, very interesting couple of days. And Mr. Fiorini, it got to some of your issues that you'd raised in the town hall meeting, and you explained to the council last time about what models or integrated suite of models can you really use to tease out these consequences. So it was a very revealing and interesting couple of days. I think the invited panel just did a wonderful job on explaining the functioning of the delta from the hydrodynamics, and at some point you wish to see some of those animations that they put together. It was very, very insightful. The other thing that I would just say about that particular workshop is just the value of models. And what was very interesting is this workshop was entirely about models. The level of the science dialogue, suddenly it wasn't about this is my opinion, that's somebody else's opinion. It was really down in the nuts and bolts. Well, this was a good attempt in this model, but here were the elements that were missing, and these are the sorts of issues or the algorithms that you should consider including in the model in the future. So it was very productive 2 days, I think. So that was generic activities, and if there are any questions on that before we jump into the real action, I think, which is the science plan.
Okay. Questions? Nope. Go ahead.
Okay. Right, with the science plan itself, this is, of course, our number one priority in the science program, and it's basically why we're here. And so if you recall, you asked us during the last meeting to articulate far more clearly what is going to go into the science plan. And you indicated also that you want to be engaged, which we embrace. And this is not just science, but it's the science policy interface. And so what I'm going to do is to go through our current thinking on the science plan. And what we'd like is your direction and guidance from this meeting to make sure that we're on track, including the right elements. And then we'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk more on some of these elements. So if I can have the PowerPoint. We can put, okay. I thought it might be worth just revisiting the importance of the science plan itself. And if we go back to the announcement on July the 25th, 2012, as Chair Eisenberg is very keen to stress that Secretary Salazar and Governor Brown jointly came out with this press release and that really stressed the importance of science for solving California's water problems. And these are just a couple of excerpts from that press release. So science will guide how to best restore the ecosystem and how much water can be exported. So this is a very clear and explicit statement of what science and how science should be used. Of course, through the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan itself, you've defined the co-equal goals that must be achieved through best available science. And not only that, it's best available science and adaptive management. So these are the two cornerstones of what the science plan will lay out. So best available science is required for the covered actions, and adaptive management is required for ecosystem restoration and water management under GP1. In addition to using adaptive management and best available science for covered actions themselves, you also stated that adaptive management and best available sciences has to be used for updates to the Delta Plan. So in the science plan, we need to consider that. And coming in after this work had been done, I was very impressed about the amount of time and effort that had gone into detailing what best available science is. So without revisiting the Delta Plan itself, here I just highlighted a few of the main points. And why this is important is that if we're going to use this definition for best available science, then the science plan itself needs to put the elements in place so that you can be sure and have a defensible form of best available science. So first of all, it's a knowledge base for making sound decisions. And best available science also has to be the foundation for adaptive management. Many of these adaptive management actions are going to be very controversial. They need to be able to withstand close scrutiny, both at the legal level and the scientific level. Best available science is also specific to the decision being made and the time frame that the decision is going to be made under. And as we heard in the discussion this morning, that we cannot wait for the science to be perfect. So how do you make decisions in the face of uncertainty? And so this process has to select the science based on these 6 elements. First of all, it has to be relevant to the problem in hand. So even if there isn't information available for the part of the delta we're looking at or the delta, we have to be sure that science which is being brought in from the East Coast or the Columbia Basin or wherever else is in fact relevant to the decisions that are being made. It has to be inclusive, which means that all the information available is considered in making that decision. It has to be objective. In other words, not swayed by subjective or other factors. It has to be transparent and open so people can see where the science came from. They need to be able to access that and draw their own conclusions. It has to be timely. So a lot of what you'll see in the Delta Science Plan is how can we anticipate and have some information out there even if we don't know what the science questions of the future might be. And of course it's subject to peer review. And it has to be consistent with the scientific process. So that's just an expansion of the scientific method. Posing a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, and then having the data to draw conclusions. So that's the best available science. From the other part of these two fundamental elements, we have adaptive management. And our definition for adaptive management is actually given in the Delta Reform Act, which is here. And adaptive management states it's a framework and a flexible decision-making process for ongoing knowledge acquisition, monitoring and evaluation, leading to continuous improvement in management planning and implementation of a project to achieve specific objectives. So what we put in the science plan has to be geared towards feeding that framework and making it work. And there's no need to read the little circle on the bottom, but this is the adaptive management wheel. A lot of effort had been invested by the science program, the Independent Science Board and others in defining this. So it follows the principles of adaptive management which you read in the textbooks, but it's actually been refined here to be a little more efficient. So it's a three-phase, basically plan, do, and then you evaluate and respond, and then revisit your assumptions and decisions that were made in the planning process. So that's the three phases, and within that three phases there's a 9-step framework. And in a moment I'll sort of talk specifically how the science will inform that. So what does the science plan actually do? So this is a graphical depiction on the left-hand side of science in the Delta today. And what those different blobs are intended to be is there's multiple science programs, multiple research activities going on in the Delta. A lot of that, or most of it, is very good science. It's very focused, usually on single issues, sometimes mandated by law. A couple of the little circles off there on their own are perhaps some of the fundamental research being done in academia that may find some relevance. But essentially there's a lot of programs and activities going on out there. There's, for example, just under the federal agencies, there's specific programs, there's research centers, there's science centers out there, similarly within the state agencies. The challenge is, and of course there's the NGOs, the water agencies. The challenge is how do we pull all of that information and programs together in order to create a single foundational science that we all work from? So it's not that people don't wish to collaborate, it's just this is such a complex landscape and such a fast-moving landscape. And so what the Delta Science Plan should do is to look at how we can integrate that into a common understanding. But we're not starting from scratch. And as I listed there under examples, there's already examples of collaboration. So part of the questionnaire that we distributed at the science conference, there was a lot of very good information came back, both on the online polling and people's responses to the questionnaires. So there's a lot of examples, the IEP work teams that are open teams looking at specific issues. The California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum, that was created 20 years ago specifically to stop this combat modeling. So different people will come up with their models, and the debate was about whose model was best. What QEMF has done for California is to really eliminate those arguments. You don't see people debating one model over another so much. It's a much higher level discussion. We know what RMA model does, we know what Mike 3D does, we know what Untrim does. They all have a value, they've all been set up to answer specific questions, and the discussion is on the questions, not so much the fundamental underpinnings of the model. So there's a lot to build on there.
Huh? Say that again. It's not so much on the structure, it's on the
model, but on the questions. So a lot of the debate is, instead of arguing, is a finite difference code or a finite element code the most appropriate and most accurate to use, which was an argument commonly around 15, 20 years ago. We know those differences. We know when it's appropriate to use one model over another. So we're not arguing. All of that's debated at the QEMF level. So we don't argue about those issues now so much. Where the attention is focused on, if you're looking at, say, hydraulic exchange at a distributary channel in the delta, what is the appropriate model to use? What's the question you're asking? If it's about nutrients moving into a wetland, for example, is it a 2D model? Is it a 3D model? So the question is on what sort of question, what information do you want out of the model? What time step? We don't argue so much about model A versus model B because that's already out there, it's been documented. A third area where we see these areas of collaboration is through funded research projects. And here I just gave one example of Cascade that pulled together a very diverse group of scientists to look as a test, how is climate change likely to impact ecosystems? And it stepped right from the global climate change model predictions, you're right down to looking at things like the mussels and the food web within the bay. And now there's some new elements coming on the scene. The regional monitoring program. Shared data sets, CDEN, that the State Water Resources Control Board is focusing on. The example of what SFEI did that you heard this morning, their ability to reach out and pull together a diverse group of scientists to address some of these major issues. So the Delta Science Plan in this figure, the idea is to pull together this into and create a common knowledge database. And so it will organize and integrate Delta Science to provide both the best available science and support adaptive management. And you've probably heard us talk about this concept, one Delta, one science. That doesn't mean everybody agrees on everything, but it identifies what we know, highlights the areas where there's legitimate scientific disagreement, and helps focus our resources on those areas of disagreement. So the Delta Science Plan will include these various areas. It starts with the grand challenges. And we made a start on this at the town hall meeting, and you heard from Mr. Fiorini at the last meeting about his grand challenge. So these are the really big long-term questions that policymakers are going to have to address. Of course, in your thoughts on this and what some of the issues you're facing, we'd like to hear from you on what your grand challenges should be, what should be put on this preliminary list. And in addition to that, we've done a thorough synthesis of recent reviews, initiatives, reports coming out to see what are the major recommendations and what are the gaps in science that have been highlighted on other reports, including by the National Research Council. So those are the big questions. The second element is looking at the institutional and organizational structure that we need for science, for Delta. The third element keys off what the National Research Council have said really the Delta Science Program should be focused on. How can we improve the synthesis of scientific knowledge? When we have these separate programs that are very single-focused, I think they use the term reductionist, they're focused on a single problem, how can you link data and information across those different programs to understand the bigger picture and perhaps to get to some of the interconnections that Mr. Fiorini spoke about. The uncertainties that go with that was the grand challenge that Director Cowan had identified as his grand challenge. How do we quantify those uncertainties so that we can prioritize research actions to reduce the uncertainty in making the decisions? In order to do all of this, there's some nuts and bolts that needs to be done. And so we need to take a look at how do we manage data and how do we make sure that people can access the same sets of data. The concept of shared computer models. Some of the difficulties which we encounter right now is that not only the problem of different models, but sometimes the same model is being used with different data sets, different bathymetries, different scenarios. And of course, you're going to draw different conclusions from that. So how can we create access to the same computer models so that the time and effort goes much more into running the models and see what the models do and how we can interpret what the models are telling us rather than setting up multiple models. The next item here is the knowledge bank, and I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Knopf for his concept. We were sort of struggling what would actually go into that, and the idea of this knowledge bank for adaptive management, where people can go understand the information, access the information, and see how decisions are being made. What is the science that those decisions are being based on? And then the last item here is to begin to build on current efforts, and there's been, over the last 10 years, several efforts to look at monitoring programs. The regional monitoring program does a great job in looking at a narrow area related to water quality, but of course, from your perspective as the council, as the overarching body, you need to go beyond that. So what can we do to develop how these databases that are being put together can actually communicate and talk to each other easily? So what we have is the organization of science on the left. We then have the best available science. We have to deal with uncertainty. And within that box, which is really the actions and the science that is going on, we have a series of questions. And Mr. Nordhoff is not here now, but he had asked about prioritizing questions. And when we began to think that through in detail, we identified 3 levels. At first, there are these grand challenges, the really big questions. And to give a brief background to where the term grand challenge came from, if you go to the National Research Council, you'll see multiple documents related to grand challenges. And so these are the big long-term questions that take multi-years to address. But under those big questions, there has to be more focused science that leads into that. So we have the focused 10-year-long studies like the pelagic organism decline studies, very focused, 10 years, a lot of investment went into it, but there was an awful lot of focused outcome that came from that, including a book that will come out of all of the findings of the science that were developed during that 10-year period. And then beneath that, there's the focus studies, the single investigator, the 2 or 3 investigators who are working on projects on the timescale of 2 to 3 years. So all of those activities need to feed in to the adaptive management process and then to decision making. So if we revisit the adaptive management wheel, if science is going to support and drive adaptive management, highlighted here in the blue boxes around the edge are the points where science feeds into the adaptive management process. So if you're driving and overseeing adaptive management, these are the points in the process where you would need science to advise you, give you advice to make decisions. And perhaps what we'll do in the interest of time, we can come back and take a look at this in some detail. But essentially the way this works is you should view this in the sense of a wheel. You define the problem, you establish your goals and objectives, and then from there you develop qualitative and quantitative models to make the connections between the goals and objectives and the actions that you're going to take. So science is going to have a very, very big role in that. You then use those same models to inform the performance measures that are going to guide whether you're being successful in your action. And then, under the do section, you design and actually implement the action. The models and the science is used both during the implementation and immediately afterwards. And the monitoring design also uses models to decide what is going to be statistically rigorous in order to draw conclusions at the earliest possible time about whether those actions are beginning to achieve the desired outcomes. There's then a communication level there to summarize, make it very clear to all interested parties what those results might be. And then decisions are made there, and the various grey arrows show where you feed back into the adaptive management plan, depending on the progress that you've made. So these are the various elements of the science plan. And I'd like to just conclude with this slide. And so here we have our science on the bottom there. So it's the science organization. It's the best available science that's feeding up. And at the top there, we've got the policy and management actions. So that's the decisions that you make. It's the decisions that other agencies make. But what's widely recognized in adaptive management is what sort of interface should there be between those two areas? How do you mix the decision makers with the scientists themselves? So if we look at the quote on the bottom there, Tim Killeen, that I'm I really like this quote. Basically, he said, science is a team sport. And what that means is when we're looking at these very complex systems, you can't have single investigator or even single agency getting to the answers. If you really want to accelerate knowledge discovery, you need vast teams, you need access to data, you need people looking at the same problem from different angles. And that's how we accelerate knowledge discovery. At the same time, policy is also a team sport. Your interaction, how you interact as a council, how you interact with the public. The difficulty is that if you're playing baseball, sometimes perhaps we're playing cricket. and the question is, how do we integrate that? So it's really sort of too early to make any suggestions. There were some very good suggestions that came back in the questionnaire, because this is probably the most key part. So each of those cylinders there represent different issues. So what is the best way to integrate the policy and the science? What models can we bring back to you to make suggestions? Some of the common things which we've heard, both today and from other sources, is that there has to be early engagement. You're waiting to make a decision, and then the science is coming in later. The science doesn't quite fit with the questions that you're asking. So how can we get that early engagement? Secondly, there needs to be a continuous dialogue. And we think that this is really the place where something innovative can be done. And there's no question this is a big challenge. So if you look at the BDC Adaptive Management report that was put out by an independent panel giving recommendations to BDCP, their solution was to create a polymath, or in an 18th century, the scientist who could do everything. We've heard other things.
You mean like the Delta lead scientist, is that?
That's a possibility if you go back to the 18th century, I think. But I think in the town hall meeting, Randy, you could add to this, but there was a couple of ideas that were floated there. In terms of some sort of standing committee, so that agency directors or decision makers like yourself can engage directly, not just with the scientists in those agencies, but with the scientist or small group of scientists that can speak on behalf of the science community. And so these are just 2 or 3 things, and of course there's many other models under that. But we recognize that this is, in the science plan, this is probably going to be the most key part. The other elements, how we build a community of science, there's models there, we've got some good ideas. This is really the crux of it. The last thing I'll point out on this figure, please note that the arrows go both ways. So whatever ends up in those cylinders, the communication needs to come back to the science community so we can refine and ensure the science is relevant and timely. But at the same time, there needs to be that communication going back up to all of the policy makers. So if 3 or 4 agencies or multiple agencies are making decisions, that same recommendation you should go across the various agencies. So maybe